Crunching data, that's the key to really understanding how governments work. Digging out unique narratives, then telling the story. And putting a voice to all that data? Well, that's the job of the monthly with Senator Pamela Wallin.
Welcome to Government Analytics, the monthly, and our continuing series on rebuilding the economy in the post-COVID era. Today, a look at productivity and growth with the Honorable Lisa Raitt, CIBC Vice-chair, Global Investment Banking, and Mr. Goldy Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Both are here today because they are key players in the new Coalition for a Better Future, an organization, a group committed to combating the country's lackluster and decades-old record on productivity. Let me also introduce, before we begin our conversation today, Greg McDougall, who along with Steve Saunders are the principals at Government Analytics and your hosts for today. And they may even have some questions later. But let us begin. Welcome, Lisa and Goldy. We really appreciate you being here. Let me just start with the context in which you have gathered as a group and created this. So we witnessed this week the Three Amigos Summit, where Canada seemed unable to win any concessions on Biden's America First or the Buy America rules around electric vehicles. That's going to have a hit on the auto sector. The COP meeting in Glasgow with $130 trillion of spending planned for net zero emissions. That's going to impact oil, gas, and energy sector here for sure. Inflation raging on both sides of the border, exacerbated by supply chain issues, not to mention the profound impact that we are seeing from the human and economic tragedy unfolding in British Columbia. Also in this country, the Bank of Canada governor admitting that inflation is not transitory, and of course, spending continues unabated. So, Lisa, tell me what and who this group is and what you really intend to accomplish given the context.
Well, first of all, Pamela, thank you very much for having me on today. And I'm going to say thank you on behalf of Goldy as well. It's getting out to the public the concept of this coalition that is really important. And what I would say is this. There's 112, I think now, entities who are part of this coalition. And what all of these folks have agreed is the fact that we really should be looking at long-term economic growth in this country. When COVID happened, one of the things that was noted in the country was that we all pulled together. Private sector, public sector, people in ordinary situations, everyone felt a little bit of pain as everyone pitched in together. We had a mission, and some would say we accomplished it because we ended up having a great rate of vaccination, and as well, hopefully we'll be coming out of it soon. The question, of course, is as you come out of recovery, what's going to be happening? And the concern was that there may not have been as good, I would say, thoughtfulness around the concept of long-term economic growth. So bringing together this coalition made a lot of sense. And to our surprise, there was a lot of commonality in terms of what people cared about. 97% of the folks involved in a survey indicated their top three concerns: the economy and jobs or employment, climate change, sustainability, and making sure that whatever growth comes is equal. Inequality is of concern to them. So folks are looking forward to working with one another, getting the attention of not only public policymakers, but as well the Canadian general public on the importance of talking about economic growth in the country, because without economic growth, really hard to have climate change funded, really hard to have equality funded, really hard to fund the social services that we actually desperately rely upon when it comes to emergency situations. So that is kind of the genesis of it. But I think Goldy can give a far more concise pitch in terms of what it was that caused that spark to bring everybody together.
I will ask him just that, but this kind of begs the question, which is, this is what you want to see in government budgets and corporate spending plans. So you're just saying the timing is such, is that we're coming out of COVID, let's everybody just put away partisan issues as best they can and try and solve a problem.
So here's the thing, Ann and I are the co-chairs. We do
Yeah.
not share the same party affiliation. There's
Yeah,
a lot of
this
folks
is
in
Ann
there who are
McClellan.
from,
Yeah.
that's right. There's a lot
Yeah.
of folks in there in this coalition who have very different ideologies. They were all asked to put them aside as we work on economic growth together. And guess what? Out of 109 people who took the survey, we found 97% agreement on some fundamental issues. So I would submit that the people who represent those people in Ottawa should also have the same kind of mentality about economic growth. And the underlying point that I am probably stealing from Goldy, and I apologize ahead of time, Goldy, but 5 of the last 7 elections have resulted in a minority government. So clearly we need to work together. And I have found personally, I'm not speaking for Goldy, but the last 3 elections have very much been transactional elections.
Right.
Here's something for you, here's something for you. Maybe it lines up with a certain geography, a certain group of people in a certain geography in order to get a certain amount of votes, and forgetting the bigger picture of economic growth, which really should be driving the debate.
I think that is the concern, Goldy, which is the vision thing. We're not seeing that in the budgets, and we're not hearing it in the discussion. It's money in the short term for those who need it, and it's, you know, there's more spending, there's an inflation problem, but there's not a larger issue. Where does your sector, where does the big business corporate sector come in?
Let me just say, first of all, thank you for having me, and a delight to be here with my friend Lisa. Let me just pull back a little bit, and I'll get to specifically to that, is to say, first and foremost, we have to see that the world has changed fundamentally. We're seeing it, as you just referenced, the Three Amigos meeting. What was isn't anymore. The world is fundamentally evolving. It was naturally happening in some ways, but COVID has accelerated. And Larry Summers calls COVID a hinge moment, where things have shifted towards Asia and stuff. So it's getting complicated out there, and it's getting messy out there. So that's the bigger context that I think Canada has to figure out a chart a course forward. Second thing I will say is that I sleep extremely well at night, knowing that I have never been let down by the collective wisdom of the Canadian people. They are a smart group of people. And I think they realize that the world is changing, and that what they're looking for is leaders in government and business and labor and academia to work together to solve the problems that are in their day-to-day lives. No one sits at home and discusses trade agreements or even what happened at COP or so forth. They are focused on their everyday lives, and they're counting on leaders across this country to do what needs to be done to make life better for them, to put it simply. Which brings me to the thing, like, why do we need this? And I say this out of the greatest of respect for everybody who seeks public office, but politics has become really hard. You know, it is becoming difficult to just simply come in and say, I've got a vision, and this is what the plan is, and this is what I want to do. It's largely driven by social media, the reactionary environment of polling and the short-termism, and you know, it's hard to think out a little further ahead. And you don't get rewarded for that to some extent. But then I also say that in what Lisa referenced, 5 out of 7 elections have produced minority parliaments. And it might be because Canadians have not seen the vision thing. They haven't seen the big picture. Now, look, every government, this one's no different, actually will say, and I think they're legitimately in saying, we have a plan. We're executing our plan. Some people don't like the plan that we're executing, and that's fine, but we have a plan. What I would like to see happen is coming together in working on that plan, a partnership that's genuine between business and government and labor and other civil society groups. And that's what the coalition is all about. It's trying to be helpful to governments in our country and say, here's a group of people that's never been pulled together before, but they represent us, they support you know, politically, they're all across the spectrum, as Lisa said.
Right.
Some of them are not even political at all. They're just interested in their issues. This gives you an opportunity to depoliticize an environment that's globally very toxic politically, right? We're seeing what's going on in the US, for example. Right. We need to work together. That's the message of this coalition. It's not we and us, we and they, it's us.
All right, I want to say, and I'm so glad that you're both so enthusiastic about this, because the problems you cite are very real, and we have been dealing with so many issues. The list I read could be 3 times longer, and just the inflation that we're going through right now, the supply chain issues. This is hurting people. I was talking to my niece who runs a care home for the aged. She said, within weeks, we're going to be having, we're going to be cutting down from 3 meals a day to 2. The money doesn't cover the needs to feed these people, the cost of the food. This is real. So the problems that people are having. So we've got your organization, we've got a group of senators, the Prosperity Action Group, who said we need to take this on. Phil Cross from the Fraser Institute says we need a root and branch reexamination of public policy and our commitment to the markets. Why and how are you going to make this real, Lisa? You were in the political game a long time, so was Goldy. But how do you get somebody's attention and see it happen?
Well, what I'm hopeful for, and what makes me want to continue to give 100% of my effort to the coalition, is I know this happened before when it came to a fiscal matter, and it happened in the 90s when I was still in university. And everyone in the country rallied around the notion that, look, we really need to get our debt and our deficit under control. Mm-hmm. And the government reacted. And, as Anne Paul Wells reminded us, actually, Anne and I, that if you took a look at that seminal budget that Paul Martin introduced in the 90s, it wasn't a 6-inch thick document that you see these days. Right. For budgets. It was very slim. And it just kind of said, here's the plan, and this is what we're going to do. So what I'm hopeful of is, as you gather together in the coalition, all of these organizations, so 112 of them now, but they reach tens of thousands of people, that those folks are going to understand how important economic growth is. It becomes a tabletop discussion. It becomes a water cooler discussion. And that's who pressures politicians, Pamela, you know that. It's getting that question at the door. What are you doing for economic growth? Not the transactional, am I going to be able to get this job? It's a bigger picture. What are we doing as a country? So convening all of these groups together, having them talk to one another as opposed to talking to the government, and coming up with, I guess, markers of things that are important to determine how well we're doing as a country. And we ended up with a scorecard, and we can talk about the scorecard later. But that is important. We're going to measure what it is. First of all, we defined how we measure economic growth. We're going to measure those economic growth indicators, and we're going to report on it and hold people accountable. Big business, small business, everybody who's involved in the coalition. And we're going to publicize and talk about it. And hopefully it'll hit home with the folks who are decision makers and public policy thinkers in all the provinces as well, and the territories as well federally.
When we look at the debt levels already, and Canada piled on new debt at a faster rate than any of its group of 7 peers during the pandemic, we've got a very high level of indebtedness. So that makes it harder. I know government says it's going to keep spending. That's what their last budget said. But it's harder to manage these issues if you're just still trying to get your head above water, unless you just subscribe to the modern monetary theory, which is we'll just keep printing money. Goldy?
Well, look, I think in fairness, the government's response has been well received by the public. Right? And we were instrumental in working.
In COVID, you mean?
Yes, to the response to COVID. Yeah. Sure, there was some spending perhaps in excess of what was necessary to actually respond to COVID. And that's been communicated by other bodies, including international bodies that have looked at our spending. But overall, I think the government's response has been generally well received, that people felt that the government had their back. And this is a macro issue in the backdrop and what we're talking about here. But around the world, the era of big government may be returning. But we know that big government comes at a cost. And so what we want to talk about is to say, We believe in those social programs. We believe in what defines Canada and the characteristics of being able to take care of each other and having an equalization program and all of those elements. But we also recognize the importance of public policy in that arena. So what are we up against? We're up against populism, right? It's just, we're just going to make promises, or governments around the world, we're just going to be popular and say the popular thing. But governing is hard. That hasn't changed. As I said off the top, it's gotten harder. So again, we're not going to be able to talk to the public on given days about productivity and all of those words. You never hear competitiveness at the door. I'm sure Lisa will validate that. But we've got to be able to translate what are core economic issues in how you build not just an economy, but how you build a society, how you build a country, and make them understandable. I mean, I grew up in Alberta with Ralph Klein. He called the debt a mortgage, you know, and everybody got that. We got to pay down the mortgage. Nobody wants to run up the mortgage. That's a bad idea, right? And then he understood in the context of interest rates that, you know, you got to pay down the mortgage when you can, because if you don't, you might have to pay. Keep it simple. So part of this is the art of communicating to the public the priorities and why they should be the public's priorities as well. So the second point about public policy matters, I couldn't stress that enough. You know, we all want to build a better Canada, but the way in which you go about doing it is debating public policy and having discussions. And again, I go back to trusting Canadians. If you were on campus, like I was on campus in the free trade election, based on what I saw, even though I was at the University of Calgary, I would have never thought free trade was going to win that election. And yet, in the sensible, good judgment of Canadians, they endorsed a policy that might have been a high-risk one. We may have become Americanized. We may have lost hockey and all the things that you've heard about. But Canadians trusted Canada, and they trusted themselves. And thank God, because where are we without that today? Well, today we are going to have discussions about our immigration policy, our foreign investment policy, our Indigenous reconciliation policies, our infrastructure policy. And part of what the coalition is saying through the scorecard is the world's changed to the extent that we can't get by on what got us here. US is no longer the US of your daddy or your granddad, but neither is China. So we've got to figure out, what do we want to be when we grow up? And that means actually having a look, and this is a loaded term that some people like and don't like, but the notion of an industrial policy, I just call it a strategy. What's the strategy for Canada? If these were all out there and we're all competing, how are we going to attract people? How are we going to attract capital? That's the kind of conversation I think Canadians deserve to hear from politicians across this.
And that brings up the notion when you say industrial policy, and the reason it twigs people, because it means picking winners and losers. So I want to put this in. I'll come back to the group in a moment, but we have seen from the COP conference, from Mark Carney, from the banks, that we need $130 trillion worth of spending on the greening of the economy. When you drill down again on this, and Goldy, maybe you have that trust in the Canadian public, $60 billion a year, forfeit some of the benefits of our carbon-based lifestyle, our the way we heat our homes, or the way we cool our homes, or the way we grow our crops, that is all going to have to change, and it's going to be more inconvenient, more expensive. That's a hard sell, Lisa.
Well, that's the job of the government, to create the narrative that gets the public to buy in. Otherwise, you end up with the situation we just saw at G20, Senator, where everyone comes in and they're going to be talking about climate change, and they're going to be talking about the importance of funding. However, what they ended up talking about was energy security. And by the way, OPEC, could you open up the taps a little bit more for us? So you went from wanting to talk about climate and how you turn off fossil fuel going into the future. But in that moment, they had to talk about how they can get more fossil fuel into their countries. Because why? Because people are freaking out about how much gas is costing them at the pump. And that has an immediate impact on any politician, whether or not you're in the United States or in Canada. So yes, it's going to be painful to get to net zero. And perhaps we're all not having the conversation about how costly it's going to be. But that being said, it's going to be a lot more difficult if we don't have a plan for economic growth. And we're not seeing that right now coming from the government. And that's why it's important for Canadians to recognize, okay, listen, Canadians do want to have a cleaner environment. They want to be seen to be carrying a really good reputation around the world on it. However, They also know that it has to be paid for, but they don't know how much it's going to cost. And if they can say, look, we got economic growth to level it out, then it'll work. But I'm just not convinced right now. We have the economic growth side of the table. 1.7% growth is anemic. You need 4 to 6% growth annually in order to even start thinking about paying for healthcare going into the future. You and I, Senator, know the healthcare system well. You're a caregiver. I'm a caregiver. Yeah. It's a disaster. And it's a disaster that's coming at us very quickly.
Well, and post-COVID, we've really seen the worst of it as people are taking a hit because they weren't treated. The cost of these things, and now, you know, that's another example. We know we're going to have to put money into the healthcare system because it hasn't been functioning. When you talk, Goldy, about making business greener, that's a cost. That's not a benefit in the short term. And as Lisa said, we've got governments running around asking OPEC to step up production. And we're looking at Alberta and Saskatchewan and going, yes, but we have it here. But, you know, we want to slow that down and shut the doors because we're trying to green. Like there's some real inconsistencies here.
Well, look, let me just say, first of all, that I'm very proud to represent a group of leaders who, back in their wisdom in 2008, endorsed carbon pricing. It's probably the most market responsive approach to begin the process. It's not a magic bullet. It's not something all by itself, but I want to put that out there because the business community of Canada that at least I represent has already started and commenced the journey of the transition or transformation, because you know what, Pamela, at the end of the day, government or not, your shareholders want it, your stakeholders want it, your employees want it, your community wants it. And you know what that becomes? Just becomes good business. So, okay, so let's get on with this journey. And so now you've seen significant announcements, mostly from Alberta-based companies, which I don't think get enough credit for this, to say, all right, we're going to put billions of dollars of capital allocation for a 6 to 8 to 10-year horizon to innovate on carbon capture, on a blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, on SMRs, the small modular nuclear reactors, and so forth. Because what's happening here is governments around the world get together, make all kinds of promises and commitments and targets, and they respond to political pressure and the protests and the movements and all of that. But you know who has to do the work? The private sector has to do the work. The private sector has to fund it. The private sector has to work within the regulatory frameworks of every different society out there. The private sector has to have the talent, the innovative capacities, all of which I would bet on Canada. That Canada and Canadians can lead this transition if we are honest about the journey in and of itself. Look, we've reduced emissions 1% in 15 or 20 years, 1%. We just made a commitment to do 45 by the end of this decade. I want to achieve that. How are we going to do that? What is that transition going to look like? Where are the gaps? I mean, you take a look at the lack of a grid in Canada. We don't have an electricity grid. And then you come up at the other end of this extreme, you see a project that Hydro-Quebec has successfully negotiated with the state of New York. They want to be able to get hydroelectricity there. It's the equivalent of taking 700,000 cars off the road. And yet again, there's a protest on the other side that says, but you're going to take down some trees. So we've got to have an honest conversation with people that this is going to be hard, but we can do it. And human behavior is only going to be a small percentage of the emission reduction. It's heavily going to be reliant on innovation. And that is going to take some time, and it's going to take some significant capital investment. So no one's denying that climate change is real, that the transition needs to happen, but we do need to bring the public with us. And here's the reason I say it, and it's in response to the other questions that you asked. I worry about populism. I worry about populism because I think we get a little smug and a little comfortable that Canada is special and Canadians are extraordinary. Yeah, we can say that to ourselves, but we're just human beings. And if this thing starts interferes with my quality of life, my standard of living, my ability to pay for dinner, or my ability to get my kids educated, or whatever,
or heat my home,
all of a sudden somebody else, or heating my home, something as basic as that, all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, you know what, that's all bunk. We got to do this instead, and I'll make sure you're okay. Well, that's wrong. That's going to create bigger problems. But in the short term, it's going to be disruptive. We can't afford that. So we have to have business, government in particular, working together on explaining what this transition looks like, what that journey is, and make sure the public is coming along with us. Because if we get too far ahead of them, there's a risk that businesses are not going to pull back. Like, we're going to continue to invest, But we can't have episodic regulatory policies that say do this and don't do that 3 years later. We're all in. We are committed to the climate change transition. Now we need to make sure we can bring the public with us.
And that, Lisa, brings me back to the banks for a moment, because if you say, as at Mark Carney's behest, that you're going to spend $130 trillion on greening the economy, it begs the question, so does that mean no more lending to traditional sectors? You're not going to support the oil and gas sector? Because that's exactly the point that Goldy's getting at, which is, how do you sell that? That we're going to shut down a major industry, or at least slow a major industry that creates hundreds of thousands of jobs in this country, and make that palatable and say that it's a good thing for people.
Yeah, I think jumping to that conclusion that by 2050, which is a long way away, that we're all going to be divested out of oil and gas is something that actually nobody can say, because nobody knows what the future looks like. I think the common recognition is that there's still going to be fossil fuels in 2050. And the goal in Canada should be that we are the last barrel to be sold, because we're ethical and we do it responsibly, and we do it in an environmental way. And our oil producers are looking at net zero by 2050 themselves, and we'll have a plan. But Pamela, I want to underscore as well something that you brought up. You brought up at the beginning Biden's tax credit for electric vehicles. So here's my concern. I believe that Minister Wilkinson has set out a path for Canada to get to net zero. I do believe it. I think that they put into place these things, it'll happen, but it's a big cost. In the United States, Biden has a plan as well, and it's out there on the website, so you can look at it. But you know what the difference is? He also has the economic growth side of it. And part of that economic growth side of it is, we're going to corner the market on electric vehicles. We can't pay for this otherwise. So we're going to have to bring in these really awful, predatory, and I would say protectionist policies and tick off the rest of the world, because we're going to transition.
That's what
we're not going to do it at our cost. We're going to actually take it over. And that's Canada's problem. We can't be lagging behind and have our hat in hand saying, could you please change your mind? They're not going to change their mind.
It's also an opportunity, because it comes right back to, there's only two components of the Canadian economy. We're a natural resource economy and we're a human resource economy. That's what we're made up of. We have 11 of the world's top 35 critical minerals. We have the capacity to help North America have energy security. But the first thing they did was cancel Keystone. They're debating line 3, line 5. You know, we've seen this reaction in Maine. The reality of the situation is that Canada can be a leader, and we have to leverage our strengths and our assets. And I applaud the government's sort of strong stance in the United States to be able to say, listen, we're not happy. You know, we do better when we work together was the right message to deliver, and they did that. The concern is, I'm not sure what we got. And so it's all the more reason to be looking out for our own national interest and not relying that, you know, what got us here is going to get us there, as I said earlier.
That's exactly the concern. And historically, we have this problem. We think if there's a Democrat in Washington, that we're all going to live happily ever after. It has never been the case.
Quite the contrary, in fact. Democrats is the opposite, right? Much more protectionist. So
far more protectionist.
Can I just say one other thing, Pamela, about this whole issue around the emissions thing. It's the concept is net zero.
Right.
It's not zero. So we have to remind people that there will be emission producing industries that are going to do everything that they can to bring down their emissions, or, you know, reduce the footprint, offset by the innovation of the industries and new innovation that is going to help bring down emissions. The net effect of that is to be zero. We have to clarify for people who say, just turn everything off. Okay, but we have nothing to turn it back on with. See what happened in Europe. 500% increase in weeks, not months or years, in weeks for their energy costs, right? Norway, who said, oh, we're off the oil and gas because they have a really nice, sovereign wealth fund, turn the taps back on. Why? Because it's hard. You can't just will something away. You got to have the plan, the strategy, the execution. And remember, the biggest piece of this is the unknown innovation that's going to need to take us from here to there. That costs money. So you asked about Mark Carney. That $130 trillion is larger than global GDP for context.
Exactly.
It's more money than exists out there today, number one. Number two, the inclination to want to force divestiture has backfired. And so everybody's backing away from that to say, careful what you wish for, because the ones who need to bring down the emissions are the ones who are creating the emissions. So if you don't help them figure out how to bring those emissions down, you may feel good about it, but you haven't solved any problems, number one.
Well, I think that we're really getting to the core of the political issue here, which is, to your point, Lisa, this has to be sold, not only to the Canadian public, it has to be sold to the political leaders. I think it's fair enough to say that business has been on this because it is in their own self-interest to do it. Politicians tend more to just want to be liked, want to be loved, and engage in those transactional encounters that you described. So where do you get it? I mean, we have governments paying, of all stripes, paying lip service to the importance of all these issues, but it's got to be real. So where do you start? Do you start with that younger generation, which is the staffer level in government, trying to create the growth for that or the support for that inside? Do you get the political leaders on side so that the orders go the other way? Realistically, how do we do this?
Well, I think by talking about the scorecard and measuring what's going on in terms of economic growth and telling Canadians we're really not doing well, perhaps people will understand that this is a crisis. So back in the Martin days, Anne reminded me, Anne McClellan, my co-chair, she reminded me that part of the motivation was because they were being told that they were going to have their ratings reduced to that of a third world country. And that got everybody's attention. We dealt with COVID because it was a massive crisis in healthcare and pandemic, and it impacted us. Economic growth is exactly the same thing. And perhaps right now, the people who get it are the members of the coalition, the 112 organizations who are on the ground and concerned and looking to the future. And we're just trying to set up some parameters so people can see for themselves that this is an issue that needs to have some kind of look at it. And please encourage politicians at every level, and you should encourage yourselves too, to look at it. So I don't think it's about going after the youth. I don't think it's about going after, middle managers. I think it's really recognition before we get to a crisis point that this is a matter that is very urgent.
Okay, I'm going to try not to be cynical here, but you are going to, and I want to hear from both of you on this. You've got your checklist, your 23 points, and you're going to hold people to account. There it is, and people can find that online, and they should. So you're going to have a press conference in 6 months or a year or another one in 18 months and say, I'm sorry, government isn't focused on this, and you've been bad, and you've only you've got partial check marks on 15 and none on 10. So then what?
Well, then what is you're arming Canadians with real information that they can use in order to affect change. It's a democracy, and that's what we want. We want people to be informed. One of the interesting impacts of COVID is the fact that everyone suddenly became an expert in vaccination rates and our values, and we understood it. We got it. If it's important to us, we will understand the numbers behind it. So providing these numbers and showing Canadians that, you're worried about poverty? Well, this is how poverty is trending in this country, and it doesn't look good. Are you worried about unemployed young men coming out of high school with nothing in front of them? Well, you should be, because here's the statistic. Are you worried about the fact that in middle management, we're not utilizing the entire workforce? Well, you should be worried, because here's the numbers here. And just continue in a nonpartisan way, Pam, this is really important, in a nonpartisan way to ensure that all people are actually informed. Now, if a party comes along and they want to pick up pieces of what the coalition is putting out, great, fill your boots. Obviously successful, doesn't matter to me. I don't care who picks it up as long as somebody does.
Goldy, sorry, I just want to put this out there, which is businesses, the ones you represent, vote often with their feet. And if they don't think these questions are being answered, if they don't think the government of the day is paying attention, then they go and invest somewhere else, put their money in another country.
They certainly vote with the wallet, that's for sure. And I am concerned about that because we have to compete. This is not, like I said, we can't rest on the laurels of past success, because you know what? We're one of the luckiest countries, if not the luckiest country in the world. We are, blessed with geography. We're blessed with, the natural resources. We live next to the G1 here. We've got water around us in 3 places. I mean, we are lucky, but luck can run out. You can't rely on luck alone. You actually have to be deliberate and intentional and have a strategy about how it is that we're going to be able to move forward. And so to those who are listening, who are policymakers and what Lisa did for a living, or what I used to do once upon a time, we all get into it for all the right reasons. We love our country. We want to make life better for people, and we want to make a difference in the role that we have. The short-termism that is hijacked politics around the world is going to kill us. It's going to be the death of us if we're not careful. We need leadership that we're going to reward. I feel strongly that the next majority government in Canada is going to be when Canadians see a vision and a plan for the long-term future, not just about themselves, but knowing that we're doing something to make life better for our kids and our grandkids. And that's what this exercise of the coalition has been all about. Please leave your partisanship, and please leave your industry-specific issues at the door, and come in here and ask yourself one question: what can I do to make life better for my kids and my grandkids? If we can't lay down our arms and come together to work on that question, then we're not the special people that we think we are. I have a lot of confidence that Canadians are smart, that we should treat them with respect. We should share with them good information, good data. We should allow them to discuss and debate, and yes, disagree. That is all right. As I said, every government thinks they have a plan. I'm not questioning their motives. I'm not questioning their plans. What I'm saying is, as Lisa suggested, the evidence is it's insufficient to get us to where we need to go. 1.7% GDP growth can happen by pure population growth. We don't need to do anything. All we have to do is just let in 300,000-400,000 immigrants a year, and we're good to go. I mean, if you don't believe me, just look at the last year. GDP collapsed. Why? Not just about COVID. We didn't have any immigrants, right? You want growth? Just get rid of the interprovincial trade barriers alone will help grow your economy 2 to 4%. But that's not enough. We need to have a vision for how we as a country are going to compete to attract talent and to attract capital. Because let me tell you, one thing that has happened, it's become way more competitive out there. And so I agree with you that people can walk or talk with their money. I'm saying people want to help Canada. The people I work for, the people that have come together in their coalition, are about nation building. And we want to work in partnership with governments, with labor community and others to say, let's help make life better for our kids and grandkids. Surely to goodness we can do that.
I think people do have that motivation, and many among your group, Goldy, the senior business leaders, but at a certain point, if the environment is not there, if we keep on spending and keep on printing money and keep on letting inflation grow and keep on letting supply chains collapse, at a certain point, you've got to say, this is not a good place to do business.
Yeah, but the spending issue, I'm not so averse to the spending if it's spending with purpose and outcomes at the other end. So for example, what do we oppose? Generally speaking, we have a history, and it's all driven by politics and red and blue and green and orange. Everybody does it, but it's peanut butter. Let's just spread it around. Let's make sure every constituency in which we got a chance to win, the money is there. But that produces minimal outcomes, right? So we need to do a better job of measuring and saying, what lane are we going to pick? I have been pretty clear in saying there's no way Canada should not be leading the climate transition and being the place for innovation to happen, for investment to happen, which brings about growth, which pays for those social programs that takes place. There are other areas, ag tech, biotech, clean tech, fintech, all of these things, but you got to pick some lanes. I applaud the supercluster program. People will say, well, why is he doing that? No one's really paid attention. You should. It's a small investment, $900 million in five different areas. But now we need to say 3-4 years later, which one of those is doing well enough that we should double down on? Not, we need to give everybody more money. Which lane should we go in? And that's hard. You both know politically, that's hard to do, but that's what we're going to get cover for.
I'm going to come back to Lisa on that, because that's exactly what Goldie was referencing about the free trade election. Everybody was looking at which industries were going to be allegedly killed or die, and some did, of course.
Yep.
Some people were hurt, others were allowed to grow. So that takes political will, because politicians then have to stand up and say, so sorry, you're yesterday's news, you're out of here, but here are the 3 or 4 things we're going to focus on, and if you can figure your way to benefit from that, good for you. But we're not actually seeing a lot of that, of people wanting, of political leaders on all sides taking a stand and making those hard decisions that Goldie's talking about.
Well, they're going to get forced to do so by worldwide competition. And we had the president and founder of Moderna speak to us at the coalition's conference a couple of weeks ago. And he was very clear. He said, you know, I know as a Canadian, you like to sprinkle it all around the country in order to be fair to one another. But here's the deal. In the United States, we have an ecosystem. It's well funded by universities. It's well staffed. And guess what happens? They start coming in. And all of a sudden, you do have this incredible space where innovation is happening, where there's economic growth. And that's where they are. That's where they're hanging out. So yeah, you do have to pick winners and losers, I think, and it's going to be forced upon us by what's happening outside of the country. And I thought the Prime Minister said something extremely interesting yesterday in a Q&A. And I don't know whether it was meant to be said or if it was just an expression of something that they're talking about in cabinet, because that sometimes happens, as you know. You sometimes let slip what's actually happening behind the scenes. But he was asked about carbon border adjustments or something along those lines. And he said, it is not fair for Canadians to pay a carbon tax when no one else in the world is paying carbon taxes. And I went, aha, you get it. You understand that this is a worldwide competition. So
That's
I had great
saying
hope.
out loud. Yeah.
I had great hope.
Yeah.
I have great hope that maybe what they're getting is the fact that the geopolitics on this are going to dictate how Canada reacts. And by goodness, I would say something else, but I can't say it on live. But by goodness, you better pivot soon, guys. And we're here to help you, and all businesses behind you, and including the charity sector.
There are ecosystems though that have started to form here. Again, I want to be positive about the fact there are things that are going on. Take a look at the artificial intelligence. You know, we're number 3 in the world behind US and China. Edmonton and Toronto and Montreal, these are places that the quantum technology that's available, and Canadians can lead the way. Again, it's being purposeful, it's being deliberate, it's being intentional, and it's working in the spirit of collaboration and cooperation that we can put the national interest and the well-being of our people ahead of political interests or business interests for that matter.
And the oceans sector out in Nova Scotia, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my home province.
And I see Greg wanting to ask a question here, but just let me, are the things you're talking about actually their economic changes and shifts and pivots? Will it make us more productive?
In Nova Scotia, they'll tell you it will. I've been sitting in a lot of round tables out there, and that ocean sector is starting to boom, and the companies involved in it are starting to boom and creating jobs. Halifax is hopping. I mean, their pre-COVID unemployment rate in Halifax was the same as in Toronto. I can't remember the last time I saw that. And it's not a university government town anymore. It's
I'm just asking whether you know, greener industries or high tech and new tech really is by definition more productive or not. I mean, I think the jury's out on that, Goldie.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll let the academics and others speak to that. But what I will say is that the undercurrent of all of this that we need to be conscious of is the anxiety that people are feeling about the change that's happening.
Exactly.
You know, there's a saying I saw on a billboard in Calgary way back 30 years ago. It said, the only one looking forward to change is a wet baby. And yet we are here now where change is constant. It's coming at us. And it's creating anxiety and apprehension because people are starting to feel, I might get left behind in this change. So who's got me? And this is what Donald Trump tapped into, right? He tapped into that anxiety. We need to
got your back.
We need to prevent that from happening in this country. And the way you do that is you give them hope. You give them a plan. You give them a sense of, we got you. So what are we focused on? Reskilling. Help people get the skills that are necessary to say, and some of it is not about going back to university for 4 years or college for 2. It could be a 6-week micro-credentialing program, often being offered by businesses. Many of our members have opened, universities inside their companies to say, while I pay you to work, I need you to upgrade your skills because I know your job is going to be redundant in a matter of 18 months, but I'm going to help you because I need the labor. So this requires a strategy. This requires the information between governments and businesses to work together to help people, which is what this is all supposed to be about.
Yep, exactly. Now, Greg McDougall,
Well,
chomping at the bit there.
No, not at all. This is fantastic. And thank you, Senator. I'm going to take a step back a little bit and pick up on what Goldy said when he was talking about natural resources and human resources as being core to who we are as Canadians. And a bit of what Lisa said, because Lisa and I do share a bit of the same heritage, although I am a mainlander and Lisa comes from the island. But back not a number of decades ago, I mean, I grew up in a province where Bob Stanfield was the premier, and the whole time he was premier, he was Minister of Education, which speaks to the point that education equals productivity. He got it, and that's half a century ago. The follow
did the same,
exactly. In Alberta, I trust Goldy the same. And with a fallout from that, though, in Nova Scotia, as Lisa just said, is picked up on it in a big way. One of the mandate letters of the new government has them doubling their population over the next 40 years. And when I speak to people back home, I talk to them. I say every second house is going to have someone new in there. One of the things that came out of the Stanfield era and the nationalization of the universities, and it's again, no surprise that in Atlantic Canada, there are more universities per capita than elsewhere, is the export issue. And you got it a little bit at your conference. The gentleman who Nobel Prize winner speaking to us from New York, the Moderna guy from Etobicoke or Mississauga who spoke to us from Boston. I guess the micro issue I'd like to get your comments on is educating. They spoke about that. Not enough time, I would say, was spent on Waterloo, which is an extraordinary case study. Goldy, you spoke about clusters. How is it that we can keep those we educate, those we need? And when I say educated, it doesn't need to be university. It can be from, as you said, Goldy. How do you keep them in our game on our side so we as a country can be more competitive? As was experienced in Nova Scotia, and Lisa, you know this as well as I, the biggest export for decades were people.
Still is.
Yeah. And so how do you, Nova Scotia government's actively trying to turn that around. What are your views on that? How do you crack that nut?
Well, it's not only keeping them, it's attracting them at the same time, which is part of the challenge. You know, I often think, again, go back to what's the vision for the country? What are we trying to do here? What are we trying to be? And I'm not sure there's an answer to that question today, right? And so the engagement of Canadians is to say, what do you want us to be? Some will say, I want us to be the natural resource economy that's leading the transition. Others might say, I want us to be home to the world's smartest workforce that is the most diverse, that's the most connected, and I want them to call Canada home, and I don't even care where they work given what's going on around the world. But we need to have a strategy as to how to make those things happen. I agree with you, particularly on, we put all the emphasis on universities and so forth, and they're a critical piece of this puzzle, the R&D that comes out of them. We need to commercialize better. So there's a broader supply chain of issues here that we need to uncover. But the attracting part is equally important because the two are connected. Why do people leave? Why did Mr. Rossi leave? At some point, there was an attraction on the other side that said, I can do better over here. I can get the talent that I need over here. I can get the funding that I need over here. I like the attitude about risk-taking and growth and culture. It's different. Say whatever you will about America. There are things that you can like about America, right? Without becoming American. People around the world are shopping like they've never done before. So do I think we'll ever have a shortage of a lineup of people who want to come to Canada as immigrants? Absolutely not. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who do we want? Who do we need? Who can be successful when they get here? And can we keep them? So this goes back to my earlier point. Policy matters. It's not about just one thing. That's why the scorecard is as robust as it is. We've got to be competitive on regulatory stuff. We've got to be competitive on taxation. We've got to be competitive on the quality of our healthcare system. We've got to be competitive on the infrastructure that we have because we are an export economy. I mean, just look at what happens when just one catastrophe can really empty your grocery shelves. You know, we've got to expand our ports. We've got to have broader railway systems. We've got to have, these are all connected policy issues that the average person doesn't think about every night because they're busy running their lives. But if we're not thinking about it and governments aren't thinking about it, then you're going to fall behind. And the scorecard is going to be a drumbeat to keep the pressure up, much like the trust barometer that we're familiar with, measures every year. If you're going in there and you're saying, you know, government, you've done an awesome job on these 7, 8 things, and here's the outcomes of that. But we're falling behind over here, and not things that we pick randomly. These are OECD measurements against the countries we compete with. Right? That's going to keep up a drumbeat of pressure, whether the government's red or blue or some combination thereof, and or whether there's a minority or majority, it won't matter. Canadians will be able to see we're doing well over here and we're falling behind over here. So let's deal with that. I trust Canadians that we can do that.
Yeah. So Greg, I'm going to, obviously my political ideology will come out as I answer your question. And that the reality is that I believe the hook on keeping people is by supporting Canadian families, that the family unit is what is incredibly important in our society. And that is what's going to drive decision-making for kids like mine to determine if they're going to go to the States or if they're going to stay in Canada. You know, is the family supported here? Is everybody happy? Are we making money? Is there good services? Those things are all important, but those are the things you get with economic growth. And I know that for a fact because there ain't no economic growth in Cape Breton. There's a lot of economic growth in Milton, Ontario. Guess where I'm raising my family? In Milton, Ontario, because there's a lot more for them here. So being positive in terms of economic growth is going to support a family. It's going to attract people. We cannot ever compete with certain parts of the world on the basis of weather. That's just a reality. If someone wants to go live in Florida or California, Canada's not, we don't got an option for you. But if you want to be supported and if you want to be part of an amazing country that's going to be cool and innovative and a pride place to be part of, yeah, that's kind of what we're all trying to strive for, to build as a nation.
Let me just pick up on that for a second, Lisa, and then your point, Goldy. And it's around that notion of quality of life, a notion of family and so on, and environment. And Nova Scotia picked up on that. And it's only recently through some research I've been doing, but they have a huge Engaged Nova Scotia program there that's picked up an OECD metrics. And I'll step back in time for a minute. When Hugh Siegel, who has been on our show, was chief of staff to the Prime Minister, one of the first things he came in and did was run an ad in the Globe and Mail talking about Canada as the best place to live based on OECD indicators. And so to your point, Lisa, Nova Scotia, I think gets it. I think they're moving in on it. The day that Budget 2021 was tabled, and not many people perhaps realize this, is the government itself tabled a quality of life agenda, which has to, exactly like you say, Lisa, has to blend in all of this. So thank you again. This is fabulous. Thank you again for the insights and the answers. It's really,
and
really
Greg,
good.
Just to let you know, we have former Premier Stephen McNeil sitting on the advisory group to this coalition, and he attended the entire conference, and he's been extremely helpful, especially on issues of interprovincial trade, to help us understand the path forward. And you know, they did good work in Nova Scotia. As he always said to me, he's the best conservative premier that Nova Scotia will ever have.
As a Liberal, not a
and he's a Liberal. Right. Yeah.
Can I just say, though, the lesson of Nova Scotia that you're speaking about is one that we actually want to avoid as a country, right? It was desperation. It was a crisis that created the urgency with which to say, why? We got to get our stuff together here. We got to become pro-immigration. We got to, we got to address the urban-rural issues. We've got to build better infrastructure. We've got to be able to compete. That's what happened. I'm saying, and what business leaders are saying, is we don't need to have a crisis to know that we need to do that. Let's not let this country go to political strife or populist agendas and divide ourselves. We've already seen what happens, how quickly markets respond. If you go back to the 80s when we're going through the referendum stuff, we don't need to go there. We can take control of our own destiny. We can be positive. We can be collaborative. Of course, we're going to agree to disagree on things. My wife disagrees with me on almost everything I say, but we're still married.
Okay, so we'll be booking her for the next program to see
Rebuttal.
what she thinks about that. Okay, that's terrific. Thank you both so much. Goldy Hyder, of course, from the Business Council, and Lisa Raitt at the CIBC, and their joint project, the Coalition for Better future, for a better future. So that you have your own website, I'm assuming people can go and check
Yes.
that.
Can
And
I just say that? CanadaCoalition.ca. En français aussi, but CanadaCoalition.ca.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll be back to you. When would you like us to call you back and see how the check marks are doing?
Can you
Should
give
we
us a
give you
year?
6
Can you give us
months?
a year?
We'll give you a year. Okay, we'll
Well,
give
when
you.
we'll release the numbers for the current checklist, and then maybe we'll come back for that. What do you think, Goldy?
Okay, perfect.
With a
And-
baseline show.
Senator, if
Thanks
I know that
yeah.
I know you have a following of a lot of political staffers out there. I would just give one word of caution that as politicians, I'm not really proud of the fact that we weaponized two important public policy issues, climate change and vaccine delivery. And a shame on all of us for doing that. Let's not weaponize economic growth because we really can't afford it as a country.
You are 1,000% right. And thank you for making that point. It's a very good one. So we'll talk to you, I know, before then, but for sure we'll do this again. And my thanks to Greg McDougall and Steve Saunders at Government Analytics, who create this venue for us all to try and solve problems. So really appreciate your time. We'll talk again soon.
And that's why Government Analytics takes the time to crunch the numbers, to dig and discover the real story, the data story. Thank you for joining us on The Monthly.